Jesus wanted his friends so much to share the love of God with everyone everywhere. And then he gave to them these words of assurance: surely I am with you always. And when Barnabas and Paul take up this great commission as a part of who they are and what they do, sharing God's love with everyone everywhere, they realize that Jesus does keep his promise, and he is with them wherever they go. And we see here in Lystra of Lycaonia many examples of that. But to, I think, get a good sense of how Jesus is with them all along the way, it's good to just place what's going on right here in context. It's happening all in the upper northeast region of the Mediterranean Sea. This is where the first missionary journey of Paul takes place. And the starting place is in Syrian Antioch. It is located, if you look at a map today, you know where Aleppo, Syria is. It's been just devastated by war and civil unrest. It's a city of like 4 million. I don't know how many people are there because there's millions of people who are refugees. Well, Syrian Antioch is not too far from there, just a little closer in towards the ocean. And this was a huge city back in Barnabas and Paul's day as well. And it was a significant city. It was the third largest city in all the world at that time. The only larger cities were Rome and Alexandria. And it was there in that city that we are told earlier in Acts that the followers of Jesus were first called the very derisive term Christians. And it was a pejorative term to put them down, saying, oh, you little Christs. And yet they take this as a badge of honor. And these Christians then launch out from this very strategic location to implement a very strategic itinerary to take the gospel to some key locations. And they first go down to Seleucia, down on the coast, which is a seaport town for the Syrian Antioch, and they take a boat over to Cyprus. Cyprus is an island that's not too far into the sea in that region. And there on Cyprus, they experience that Jesus is with them. They've got Barnabas, they've got Paul, and they also have Barnabas' nephew, John Mark. And as they go on their trip, they have great success in this little town of Paphos, where Sergius Paulus, who is the equivalent of a Pilate in that area. You remember Governor Pilate, the proconsul in Jerusalem area, who convicted Jesus? Well, there is another governor who's on the island of Cyprus, and he hears the message of Paul. He believes, and he accepts Jesus as his Lord and as his Savior. And he gives his loyalty to Jesus. And from this island of Cyprus, where Jesus blesses them in some significant ways, they take a boat and they catch it up to this town of Perga. Now, Perga is in really the central southern coast of what is present-day Turkey. It's very much close to the beautiful Turkish resort town of Antalya. And as we read the text this morning, as Alan was reading for us, that's actually the new town where they caught the boat to head back to Antioch after their missionary journeys were complete. But here in this area, all we're told by Luke in his history book of Acts about this first missionary journey that Paul and Barnabas have gone on is that John Mark abandons them there. Not much else they say, but something significant happened there. Then they head north up into the mountains, into some high elevation mountain lakes, and it's this town which is called Pisidian Antioch, named after the same leader, but in a different location, more in central Turkey. And as they go up to Pisidian Antioch, this is a town that began to grow a lot under the conquering of Alexander the Great. And as more Greeks and Romans began to settle there, it really took off during the reign of the various Caesars. Because as people served the growing Roman Empire out in all these various places, they wanted to return home to Rome, but because of the vast population expansion in Rome, they really weren't welcome back in this huge city. There weren't enough jobs, and there wasn't enough places to live, and it was just packed. And so many people that served the government would settle in this outpost city of Antioch in Pisidia. And when they located there in this location, it kind of reminds me of the town of Thousand Oaks where I used to live. There was nothing there at one time, and then all of a sudden, developers got some land, and airline pilots who would fly out of LAX would fly to a place where they saw the LA smog stop, and they said, I want to live there. And that town just exploded right there in what is called the Conejo Valley. Well, that's a similar thing that's happened here in Pisidian Antioch. It's just exploding, and people are retiring there, and people are finding jobs there because the land around that area is lush. And also, people who retire from military service and government positions can also be near family members who are in various outposts from there. And this is a great launching pad. And it's there that Paul preaches his famous sermon in the previous chapter, in chapter 13 of Acts, where he talks about King David and how King David is this king that they look to as this supreme leader. And then he told them about King Jesus. And many people believed. And God confirmed their words with many signs and wonders. And yet, some of the religious Jewish leaders in that place got into cahoots with some government officials, and they drove Paul and Barnabas out of town. So they go to Iconium, where we pick up the story today. And in Iconium, once again, they have powerful preaching, and God confirms their message. But once again, some religious leaders get on their case and say, we believe in God, but what you're talking about Jesus being with us all the time, we don't quite understand that or accept that. And they drove out Paul and Barnabas. And then he gets to Lystra in the town around Lycaonium. And that's where some of the wonderful things and also horrible things happen here that we can learn from. First thing that is rather dramatic is this is kind of a back hills kind of location. We learn in the text that Alan read for us that they spoke the Lycaonian language. They're not speaking Greek so much there. That's their primary language. So they have more of a tribal language there. And they have lots of legends. And one of the legends that was common in this town of Lystra was a story about a time in mythical land where Zeus and Hermes walked the world. And they walked the world in disguise. And as the story goes, as Zeus and Hermes were walking in disguise, everyone around the town of Lystra was inhospitable to them. Then Zeus and Hermes revealed themselves, destroyed everybody, killed them all, but there were these two peasants who recognized them, took them in, gave them food and lodging, and cared for them. And so Zeus and Hermes, as the story goes, provided jobs of honor for these two peasants who had basically supported them and been hospitable to them. And they let them be the dedicated guards of the temple of Lystra. And when these two peasants died, then they were turned into trees, two trees at the entrance to this temple. And so they've lived on this story all their life. And when they see Paul and Barnabas preaching, and then when Paul and Barnabas come up to a man who is crippled from life and cannot walk from the time he was born, he's been crippled all his life, they do a very Jesus thing towards that man. They say, get up and walk. And through the power of Jesus, he gets up and walks. So all the people in town say, wow, these guys must be Zeus and Hermes. Come back. And so they want to put on this big parade for them. You following this? And what do Paul and Barnabas do? I think to understand their response in this situation, we need to go back and see what others leading up to this in the book of Acts have done. Remember, Herod Agrippa killed James, the brother of John, and was going to kill Peter, who he arrested, but he was just waiting for the holiday of the Passover to get over, because he loved killing people for the Passover. And then Peter got out. Well, Herod Agrippa, went to Caesarea Philippi, where he was then given this responsibility of, it was kind of like a government shutdown, really. And there was this party, and the funds were not moving. And Herod Agrippa worked a deal that everything worked out, and the money was flowing once again. And everybody said, he's a brilliant negotiator. He must be a god. Remember that story? And Herod Agrippa says, yes, I must be. And then Acts tells us, Luke tells us in his book, that he got sick from that point on, and he died. And the worms crawl in, and the worms crawl out. That's exactly what the text says. And I think to understand how Barnabas and Paul were elevated to a place of deity, you have to understand, first of all, how Herod Agrippa responded. That's not the way to respond. I think it's also helpful for us to understand the previous sermon that Paul has preached in Pisidian Antioch, because in many ways, the Jewish people of that day was the least idolatrous people in all the world. You shall have no other gods besides me, it states in the Ten Commandments. You shall not make for yourself a graven image, it tells us. And they were a people that would not accept any form of idol. And yet, do you notice, remember, in the previous sermon that Paul gave in Pisidian Antioch, he told them over and over again, you talk about David. David has died. His body decayed. Then he said again, his body decayed. Then again, he said, his body decayed. Then again, he said, his body decayed. And he really wanted to get across the point in his sermon that David, who was in many ways deified by the Jewish people, who really deified their past and made it the most important thing about their religion, Paul was telling them, look, David is dead, but Jesus is alive, and we follow him. And we don't see his body decayed because he's living and he's with us right now. And he invited the people to respond to Jesus. And so now, when they're being pushed out of Pisidian Antioch, and they're being pushed out of Iconium, and they're in Lystra, and the people around them see in this town of Lystra how Barnabas and Paul are able to heal this man, they think that they're gods. And how do they respond? Stop the parade. Because Barnabas and Paul don't want to be idolized. They want to give glory to Jesus. You know, sometimes people think that athletes who will point up to their Lord and Savior when they make a touchdown are showboating with that. or if they say a prayer, or if they take a knee. It seems to me what they're trying to do is kind of a Paul and Barnabas thing. They're saying, look, I'm not the one who needs to be admired here. I have gifts from God. And it's like Eric Liddell, the wonderful runner in that great film, Chariots of Fire, used to say, he said, when I run, I feel the pleasure of God. But it's not about me. It's about him and me fulfilling my purposes. He must increase. I must decrease, is what John said. And that's the attitude that Paul and Barnabas are taking on. There was a show called American Idol that came on about 50 years ago. I don't know. Remember that show? Is it still on? Yeah, you watch some of the episodes, and you go, wow, that's very moving. But when it first came on, that name really bothered me. The name still bothers me. Why are we wanting to be an idol? And yet people do want to be an idol. It's like, don't be an idol. And it's not just show business people. It's not just singers. It's not just athletes. It's not just politicians and kings and presidents and proconsuls who want to be idolized, but every one of us. I think it's the original sin. We want to be like gods. What C.S. Lewis calls pride is the original sin. And when we're looking down on everybody else, it's hard to look up and see our master and maker. I think that's so true. And Paul and Barnabas are a reminder to us that we look up when we humble ourselves and don't set ourselves on the throne of our lives. I was having dinner with one of our donors for a ministry that I help support, and his name's Terry Looper, and he owns a company called Texon in Houston, Texas. It's an international company. They do petroleum products, and it's over $6 or $7 billion of a company that he owns. And he was telling me when he was visiting one of the schools in the Dominican Republic, he was talking to this lady who was a parent of one of our kids in one of the schools. And this lady had a 5-gallon tank that she would strap onto her motorcycle, and she'd take it from her village and she'd drive it into the city where she'd fill it up with gas for $3 a gallon. And then she would drive it back into the village, and then she would sell it for $4 a gallon as a businesswoman. And Terry said to her, well, that's pretty good. You've got a 25% profit margin. He says, I only have like a 1% profit margin. And she goes, that's because I'm smart. I was thinking about that story this past week, because to me it just illustrates that all of us are tempted to elevate ourselves. Terry has this new book that he's just written. I love the title of it. It's called Sacred Pace. And in the book, he describes principles for being a Christian businessman. And he's really seeking to do that and to live that. And give away what he earns in meaningful ways. And he said, the trick to being a Christian businessman is to die to self. He said, it took me a lot of years to realize this, but I know it's true now. Die to self. And I tell you, your pastor needs to learn that every day too. And I think all of us need to learn it every day. I was sitting at home last night. My wife had prepared meatloaf for us. Meatloaf. She never makes meatloaf. I love meatloaf. And it was warm and it was ready to be eaten. And she gets a call about a Sunday school teacher who's not going to show up today. And she's helping to coordinate all that. So she stops and finds a Sunday school teacher with one telephone call. 5 minutes. 2 telephone calls, 5 minutes. Then she has to send them the lesson, 10, 15, 20 minutes. My meatloaf is getting cold. I don't eat cold meat. Not me. So I started to eat. I should have said, die to yourself. It helps to die to ourselves in little things, and it helps to die to self in the big things too. Paul literally died to himself. Here's a very fascinating takeaway, and I just found this very interesting. N.T. Wright, in his brilliant biography of Paul called Paul, A Life, he describes what he believes is Paul's thorn in the flesh. There's been lots of scholars who have debated on this for years, but he goes through all the scholarship and he says his thorn in the flesh is his pulveration and being beat up constantly. That's his thorn in his flesh. And then he gives an argument for it. We'll talk about this later on if you want to know a little bit more of that argument. But his theory is that what happened in that town of Perga near Anatolia in Turkey, that Luke doesn't tell us a whole lot about, is that Paul got his first beating there. And that's why when he got to Pisidian in Antioch, he says later in his letter to the Galatians that you received me poor and beaten as I was. And that the reason Mark abandoned him is he didn't want to have anything to do with being beat up. And I think many of us don't want to have anything to do with dying to ourselves. But in my way of thinking, it's really the only way to find joy. Because when we're always promoting ourselves, we're always leaving Jesus out in the dust. Let's open ourselves up to what Jesus can do in us and for us and through us. And let's invite him to take our lives and to use them for his kingdom purposes. And as we do that, I just think of one of our members here, Chris Martin. This past week, Wednesday, he was honored as Redlands Man of the Year. And one of the things that I think is beautiful about that is he's a servant. And he dies to self. And our city has recognized that dying to self as a way of really finding admiration and glory. I know several of you here have received that honor before as well. And I know many of you are considered every year for that honor yourselves. And I just admire all of you, those of you who are deacons and those of you who serve this city in such beautiful, beautiful ways. It's by dying to self that we are then lifted up. Peter put it this way, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, and he will lift you up in due season. Cast all your anxieties upon him, because he cares for you. Let us pray.